I had just gotten married the summer the tornado came through. I lived with my husband Thomas just outside of Flint, Michigan, in a small house his dad had built after the war. He worked at the Buick plant, and I stayed home with our little daughter Susan. It was June of '53, and most of my time was spent either gardening, sewing, or playing with Susan. Life was quiet. The kind of quiet you don't appreciate until years later. The only thing most people were talking about that week was the heat and how strange the air felt. It was thick, like you had to push through it. We had a black and white Motorola TV with rabbit ears, but we mostly listened to the radio, the big console in the living room that picked up stations out of Detroit. That's where we heard about the tornadoes touching down further west. Kalamazoo had been hit a few days earlier. Thomas kept an eye on the sky every evening, even if he never said much about it. People were worried, sure, but nobody thought it would hit here. Tornadoes happened in Kansas, in Oklahoma, not Michigan. At least that's what everyone thought. That Tuesday evening, it started getting real dark out, earlier than usual. I remember sitting on the porch steps eating a peach when the wind picked up. Not hard, just strange, swirling in different directions, carrying a smell I still can't describe. Susan was inside playing with her dolls, and I'd left the windows wide open, trying to cool the place down. That's when we heard the siren from downtown. We didn't even know we had a siren until then. Thomas came running in from the garage, telling me to get to the basement. But something about his face made my stomach twist. It wasn't fear. It was confusion, like something wasn't adding up. We barely made it to the basement before the power went out. The lights snapped off all at once, and the radio upstairs cut out mid-sentence. Thomas had lit a kerosene lamp and was rushing us toward the far wall, the side with the old coal chute, when the noise started. It wasn't like in the movies. It didn't sound like a train. It was deeper, like the whole world was groaning. The house above us started creaking, then shaking hard enough to knock over the shelves. I grabbed Susan and crouched over her. I remember holding my arms over our heads, not even knowing why. Then, just like that, it stopped. The silence afterward felt wrong. We waited maybe 2 or 3 minutes before Thomas decided to check upstairs. When he came back down, he looked pale, like he'd seen something he didn't know how to explain. He said the house was still standing mostly, but everything outside looked torn up bad. With Susan in my arms, I followed him up the steps. I still remember the way the sky looked. Greenish, like old copper, and full of dust. The oak tree in our front yard had been split in two. Roof shingles were everywhere. But the weirdest part was how quiet the neighborhood was. No yelling, no sirens, just wind. As we stood outside trying to figure out what to do, I noticed something across the street. The house owned by the Simmons family, it was mostly gone. Just the concrete foundation and part of the back wall were left. But what made my skin crawl was seeing a man standing down in what used to be their basement, perfectly still. I couldn't make out much from that distance, but something about the way he stood there, just looking up at us, didn't sit right. He wasn't moving, wasn't calling for help, just staring. Thomas called out to the man, but he didn't answer, just kept standing there. I remember my husband hesitating. He always helped our neighbors when there was trouble. But something about that moment made even him freeze. He told me to go back inside while he walked across the street to check. I watched from the porch as he made his way through the debris. carefully stepping over power lines and chunks of siding. When he got close, the man finally turned and walked out of sight, down into what was left of the basement. My husband followed slowly, but when he got to the edge, he stopped and looked around for a while. Then he came back, faster than he left, not saying a word. He didn't talk about what he saw until later that night. We'd set up sleeping bags in the living room since the upstairs was full of broken glass. I was trying to keep Susan calm, all the while staring at the front door, listening. Thomas sat down next to us and whispered that the Simmons family was gone. All of them. The man he saw in the basement wasn't Mr. Simmons or anyone else he recognized. He said the guy didn't make a sound the whole time, didn't even seem hurt. But when he looked over the edge of the foundation again, no one was there. There was no back exit. It was a concrete hole. He said it was like the man had vanished. We never saw that man again, but a few days later, I overheard my husband talking to the sheriff when he came by. Turns out a few people in the neighborhood had seen someone similar walking the streets right after the tornado. Tall, older, in dark clothes, but never speaking. The sheriff chalked it up to shock or confusion. But even now, after all this time, I still remember that stare. That tornado wrecked half our street, but what stuck with me most was that man in the Simmons basement, standing there, like he'd been waiting for someone to find him. Back in 1953, my family lived on the edge of a small village in County Clare, about a half-hour's walk from the Shannon River. My dad worked nights as a railway signalman, and my mom worked at the local shop. That meant my younger brother Sean and I had a lot of afternoons to ourselves once school let out. We weren't the type to hang around the village square with the other boys. We liked our own little routines, and most days that meant heading out past the churchyard and down toward the old bridge. Every day after our chores, we'd pack a flask of barley tea, some bread, and walk to the same old field past the stone bridge, what we called the flat. It was just an empty field with a view of the hills, but it felt like our own little world. Sometimes we'd climb the trees, or play marbles in the dust, or just lie in the grass listening to the radio we brought along. One of those old Philips sets, tinny and crackly, but good enough to catch the BBC if we held it just right. I remember the first time we saw the car. It was a dark green Morris Minor, newer than most vehicles in town, and it passed us slowly on the lane by the bridge. We didn't think much of it at first, just some stranger passing through, maybe lost. But after the third or fourth day of seeing it in the same spot, usually around the same time in the afternoon, Sean started getting jumpy. He said the man inside had waved at him one day when I wasn't looking. I told him not to wave back, and to let me know if it happened again. The next day, we decided to take a different route home, cutting through the woods behind the church instead of following the road back like usual. Sean didn't say why, but I could tell he didn't want to walk past the bridge again. We didn't talk much on the way. It was quiet except for the crows and the crunch of twigs under our shoes. But just before we reached the edge of the woods, Sean stopped and grabbed my sleeve. Through the trees, maybe 20 yards off, we saw the green Morris Minor again, this time parked just off the lane, half hidden by the brush. A man stood outside the car with the driver's door open, smoking. He wasn't dressed like anyone from around here. Slick coat, hat pulled low, the kind of thing you'd see in a magazine or maybe on someone passing through from Limerick. He didn't look up, but I got the feeling he knew we were there. I pulled Sean down behind the trees and we waited, hearts thudding. After a minute or two, the man flicked his cigarette into the grass, got back in the car, and drove off. Slowly, like he was in no rush at all. That night after tea, I told my dad what we'd seen. He didn't say much at first, just rubbed his chin and told us to stay away from that side of the road for a while. But I could tell it bothered him. The next morning, he walked us all the way to school, which he never did, then stood by the gate watching the road long after the bell rang. A few of the other kids had noticed the car too, but nobody knew who it belonged to. Still, we all figured it would pass through eventually, like everything else did out there. A couple of days later, Sean was late getting home from school. Ma'am was getting anxious, but I told her not to worry. He was probably just messing about with his friends. When he finally came through the door, his face was pale. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at the floor, his hands shaking. But when I asked him what happened, he slowly looked up at me and told me something that made my stomach turn. He said the man from the car had called out to him as he was walking home. The same man standing by his car, this time with the engine running. He'd asked Sean if he wanted a lift, saying he was heading toward the village and could give him a ride. Sean had refused, and the man had smiled, too wide, too forced. He didn't press him, but as Sean walked away, he heard the man say, "I'll be seeing you around." The way Sean said it, I could tell that phrase haunted him, like he knew something wasn't right. I went straight to the guards that evening, but they didn't seem all that concerned. They told me to keep an eye on Sean, but no one seemed to take it seriously. The car didn't come around anymore, and the man was never seen again. It wasn't until years later that I found out the truth. The man had been a drifter, someone with a history of luring young boys. By then, it was too late to know what might have happened if Sean had gotten into that car. But I still can't shake the thought that we were just lucky he didn't go with him. Even now sometimes, when a car passes in the quiet of the night, I catch myself thinking about that man and how it all could have ended. It started one fall in 1953 during harvest season. My family ran a modest farm in Kansas, just outside a small town called Marion, mostly corn with a little wheat. That time of year, every day followed the same rhythm. Up at sunrise, working the fields until dusk, then dinner and early bed. We didn't have a phone in the house, just a crank-style one in the barn that barely worked, and our radio only picked up AM stations if the weather was right. Things were simple, and most nights, the only sounds were crickets and the occasional passing truck on the distant gravel road. That year, though, it was unusually dry. The air felt brittle, like everything was waiting to snap. My dad kept worrying about sparks from the equipment, and my mom stayed on edge, constantly checking the windows for signs of dust storms. I didn't think much of it until the second week of October, when we started hearing something at night. At first, it was easy to ignore, just a soft tapping, like twigs hitting the glass. Our bedroom windows faced the cornfields, and with no streetlights for miles, the nights got pitch black out there. The tapping started around the same time every night, just after we'd all gone to bed. By the fourth or fifth night, my younger sister June was too scared to sleep, She swore she saw someone outside, just standing near the edge of the field. I told her she was imagining things, but I'll admit, even I had started sleeping with the blanket pulled over my head. My dad checked the yard a few times with his lantern, even took the shotgun out once, but never found anything. No footprints, no broken stalks, just silence. That made it worse somehow, like whatever it was knew how to stay hidden. One night toward the end of October, the tapping came again, louder this time. Not like twigs anymore. It was sharp, deliberate. I was still awake, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it right on the window beside my bed. 3 taps, a pause, then 2 more. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't want to move, didn't want to look. June was in the bed across the room, and I could tell by how still she was that she was awake too. I whispered her name, but she didn't answer. The tapping came again, this time on her window. In the morning, Dad searched around the house again, getting more irritated than worried. He thought it was kids from town pulling a prank. Mom didn't say much, but I caught her nailing a folded towel along the bottom of the door that night, like she thought something might try to get in. The weirdest part was that none of the animals acted strange. The dogs didn't bark, the cows didn't spook. Everything stayed calm, which didn't make any sense if someone really had been creeping around outside. Dad said maybe it was wind or tree branches, but there weren't any trees close enough. And by then, almost all the corn had already been cut low. That weekend, our neighbor Clyde stopped by. He was an older guy who lived alone a mile up the road. Clyde asked if we'd had any trouble at night. He said he'd been hearing noises too. He'd even seen someone in his barn one evening, just standing between the tractors. But when he shouted and ran out there with his flashlight, whoever it was already gone. He told us, dead serious, to keep our doors locked and the curtains shut until harvest was over. Said the same thing had happened once when he was a boy, and that some things come out during the picking season that don't belong here. My dad didn't like that kind of talk. But that night, he left the shotgun by the door. It was the last night we heard the tapping. October 30th. The final harvest had wrapped that afternoon, and the last of the corn was stored in the bin behind the barn. We were all exhausted, but none of us fell asleep right away. Everyone was waiting. Sure enough, around midnight, the tapping started again. This time it moved from the living room window to the kitchen, then finally to our bedroom. Always 3 taps, a pause, 2 more. It was slow, methodical, like it was following a routine. I couldn't take it anymore. I got out of bed and pulled the curtain back. I don't know what I expected. A neighbor, a drifter, maybe even just empty air. But there was someone standing just beyond the reach of the moonlight. Tall, thin, wearing what looked like a brimmed hat. I couldn't see a face, just the outline, but I swear he was staring right at me. He didn't move, didn't even flinch when I looked at him. I shut the curtain immediately and stepped back, heart pounding. By the time my dad came in with the shotgun, there was nothing there. He walked the whole yard again and came back inside shaking his head. No footprints, no tracks. The tapping never came back after that night. Not once. We finished the season, and winter came early that year. Clyde moved away the next spring, and our family stayed on that farm until I went off to college. Since then, I've lived in different cities, suburbs, and apartments. but I still freeze up a little whenever I hear something tap on the window after dark. Maybe it was just someone messing around. Maybe not. But I've noticed something strange. Every October, right near harvest, I get this uneasy feeling again, like something's just outside, waiting